The sun was a merciless god over the New Mexico territory. It rained from a bleached white sky, beating down upon a land of baked earth and skeletal mesas that clawed at the horizon. Dust, fine as powdered bone, rose in a perpetual haze behind the stagecoach, a lumbering, creaking vessel navigating a sea of heat. Inside, the air was a thick cocktail of sweat, aging leather, and the stifling warmth of too many bodies crammed into too small a space. It was the tail end of spring, 1873, a time when the desert had not yet surrendered to the full tyranny of summer, but promised it with every scorching breath of wind. In the corner, a man sat as if he were carved from the very rock and dust of the land outside. His name was Silas, though no one on the coach had asked, and he had certainly not offered it. He was a man built of stillness. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, casting his face in a permanent twilight, but it could not hide the geography of a life lived under the open sky. Deep lines radiated from the corners of his eyes, etched by years of squinting into that same unforgiving sun. His clothes, a canvas duster worn smooth in some places and frayed in others, a simple homespun shirt, and dark trousers were coated in the same fine layer of ochre dust that covered everything. He didn't seem to mind. He was not so much a passenger as he was a piece of the landscape temporarily contained within the coach's wooden frame. His hands rested on his knees, large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were hands that knew the heft of an axe, the pull of reins, and the cold, dense weight of a revolver. He had not spoken a word since boarding in Santa Fe, not to the garrulous salesman opposite him, nor to the severe-looking woman with her two pale, listless children. His gaze was fixed on nothing, or perhaps on everything, looking through the window at the monotonous, shimmering panorama. But it was his eyes that held the true story. When he shifted, and a sliver of light caught them beneath the brim of his hat, they were not the clear blue of the sky or the deep brown of the earth. They were gray, the flat, exhausted gray of embers after a fire has long since burned itself out. They were eyes that had seen too much and expected to see nothing new. The stagecoach lurched to a halt at a place that couldn't rightly be called a stop. It was merely a juncture of two barely there trails, marked by a leaning wooden post and a half-empty water barrel buzzing with flies. The driver's muffled voice barked something about a scheduled pickup. The salesman grumbled, mopping his florid face with a handkerchief. The severe woman clutched her children closer, as if the very act of stopping in the wilderness invited peril. Silas did not move. His posture remained unchanged, his breathing slow and even. He was a study in patience, or perhaps profound indifference. The door was wrenched open, flooding the dim interior with a blinding, hostile light. A figure stumbled in, framed for a moment against the searing backdrop of the desert. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 17 or 18, a fragile silhouette against the immensity of the sun and sand. She scrambled aboard with a desperate haste, nearly tripping on the hem of her own dress as she hurried to escape the outside world. She threw a handful of coins onto the seat beside the driver's perch without looking, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. As she turned and the door slammed shut, plunging them back into dusty twilight, the details of her predicament became painfully clear. Her dress, a simple calico that might have once been pretty, was torn near the shoulder, and the hem was ragged and stained with dirt. Dust clung to her hair, which had come loose from its pins and fell entangled. Sweat dampened strands around her face, but it was her feet that drew the eye. She wore a pair of ladies' shoes, elegant things with a small heel, but they were a size too large. They slipped and chafed with every panicked step she took, and a dark blister was visible on the back of one heel. They were not her shoes. She stood for a moment, swaying with the resumed motion of the coach, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and the color of a stormy sky, darted around the confined space, assessing each passenger with the terrified quickness of a cornered animal. They skimmed over the salesman, who eyed her torn dress with a thinly veiled smirk. They passed over the woman, whose lips pursed in stern disapproval. They flickered past the children, who stared with blank, childlike curiosity. She was looking for something, a place to hide, a corner of the world that would not judge or condemn or, worse, ask questions. Her gaze finally landed on Silas. He had not shifted, his head had not turned, but he was aware of her. He had taken in her frantic entrance, the mismatched shoes, the terror that radiated from her like heat from a blacksmith's forge. He saw it all, but his expression remained a stoic, unreadable mask. He offered no judgment, no pity, no curiosity. He offered nothing, and in that nothingness, she saw a flicker of possibility. He was not a man of the towns, of parlors and gossip and contracts. He was a man of the wild, a place that was cruel and impartial, a place that simply was. He was a shadow, deep and silent, and all she wanted in that moment was to disappear. She took a hesitant step, the ill-fitting shoe making a soft, scraping sound on the wooden floorboards. The salesman watched her. His interest piqued. The woman narrowed her eyes. Every sound was magnified in the close quarters, the creak of the leather suspension, the rumble of the wheels, the frantic beat of the girl's own heart in her ears. She moved slowly, bracing herself against the sway of the coach, until she stood before the man in the corner. She was so close now that she could smell the faint, clean scent of the dust on his duster, mingled with the faint, masculine aromas of leather and wood smoke. It was a scent that spoke of vast, open spaces, of lonely campfires under a canopy of stars. It was the opposite of the cloying perfumes and stale air of the rooms she had fled. She swallowed, her throat dry and raw. Her hands were clenched into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. She looked at the formidable expanse of his coat. It was a fortress. It was a cave. It was an ending and a beginning. She opened her mouth, but at first, no sound came out, only a dry click. She tried again, forcing the words from a place of pure, primal need. Her voice was a bare whisper, fragile and trembling, almost lost in the noise of the journey. "Sir," she began, her eyes pleading with the shadow under his hat brim. "May I slip under your coat?" The question hung in the thick, hot air. It was an absurd request, intimate and desperate. The salesman's eyebrows shot up in amusement. The woman let out an audible gasp of indignation. For a long, stretched moment, Silas did not react. The world seemed to hold its breath. He was looking at her now. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even if she could not clearly see his eyes. He saw the tremble in her hands, the raw fear in her face, the way she braced herself for refusal, for scorn, for the blow of his rejection. He saw the ghost of the man she was running from reflected in the panic of her soul. He did not speak, he did not smile or frown. His expression did not change, but slowly, with a fluid economy of motion that was almost imperceptible, he moved one of his large, calloused hands. He took hold of the dusty lapel of his duster, and he lifted it. The gesture was small, simple, and utterly profound. It was an answer without words, an offering without conditions. It was a silent acknowledgement of her terror, a granting of sanctuary in a world that had offered her none. He opened his coat like a wing, creating a space of darkness and anonymity in the stark light of the afternoon. Tears she hadn't known she was holding back pricked at the corners of Ellie's eyes. She didn't let them fall. She moved with a desperate, grateful speed, ducking under his arm and folding herself into the small space he had made for her. The heavy canvas fell around her, a curtain dropping on the world. The disapproving faces of the other passengers vanished. The relentless sun was gone. The world was suddenly muted, reduced to the rhythmic rocking of the coach, the muffled sound of the wheels, and the solid, unyielding presence of the man beside her. She drew her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible in the warm, dusty darkness. It smelled of the earth, of smoke, of a solitude so deep it was almost peaceful. For the first time in days, She felt the frantic pounding of her heart begin to slow. She was hidden. She was safe, if only for a moment. And the silent man beside her, a stranger with eyes like ashes, simply lowered his arm and stared out the window as the stagecoach rolled on, deeper into the unforgiving heart of the desert. Beneath the heavy canvas of the duster, the world had been reduced to a universe of three things: the stifling heat, the smell of dust and old wool, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside her. Ellie had curled herself into the smallest possible shape, a knot of fear and desperation. The muffled rumble of the wheels over the hard-packed earth was a monotonous lullaby, and for a few precious minutes, the terror that had been her constant companion began to loosen its grip. The space was dark and confining, yet it was the first true sanctuary she had known in weeks. It was a fragile peace, a stolen moment in the heart of a relentless flight. This peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a vibration. It started as a low, deep thrumming in the floorboards, a tremor that resonated up through Silas's body and into her own. It was a rhythmic, galloping pulse that grew stronger with every passing second. Hoofbeats, many of them, and they were approaching with a speed that spoke not of travel, but of pursuit, from her hiding place. Ellie felt Silas's body tense. It was a subtle shift, a tightening of the muscles in his leg and back, a change as slight and significant as a hawk sighting its prey from 1,000 feet in the air. His breathing, once slow and even, became shallower, controlled. He was listening. He was waiting. Outside her woolen cave, the other passengers had noticed it too. The salesman's cheerful monologue faltered and died. The sharp voice of the woman scolding her children fell silent. The stagecoach, which had been a microcosm of mundane life, was suddenly a cage filled with held breaths. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from all directions at once, swallowing the sound of their own journey. Then, a man's voice, raw and commanding, bellowed from outside, a sound that ripped through the air and pierced Ellie's fragile shield. "Pull up now, by God, or we'll shoot the horses out from under you." Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face against the rough fabric of Silas's trousers. This was it. They had found her. The fragile hope that had flickered to life within her was instantly extinguished, leaving only the cold ash of certainty. The stagecoach slowed with a protesting groan of wood and leather, lurching to a violent halt that threw her against Silas. She heard the driver cursing, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the thunder of the chase. It was a silence filled with the heavy panting of exhausted horses, the jingle of harnesses, and the menacing thud of boots hitting the ground. Silas did not move. He remained a statue of stone and canvas. Ellie could feel the coiled tension within him, a stillness that was not passive but predatory. It was the calm of a storm's eye. The coach door was torn open with a crash that made her flinch violently. The blinding desert light flooded the interior once more, but this time it brought with it three menacing silhouettes. They were large men, blocking the sun, their forms wavering in the heat. "Stay right where you are," a voice rasped. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, a voice that carried the gravel of whiskey and cruelty. The first man stepped inside, his boots loud on the floorboards. He had to duck his head to enter. He was broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and small, piggish eyes that swept the interior with a look of predatory assessment. He carried a pistol in his hand, held loosely but with an air of comfortable familiarity. Behind him, a second man, younger and leaner, crowded the doorway, a rifle held across his chest. A third remained outside, a silent guard. The salesman raised his hands, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "Now, see here, gentlemen," he stammered. "There's no need for trouble. Take my wallet, anything you want." The leader ignored him. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, over each person, He looked at the salesman with contempt, at the woman now clutching her children so tightly they whimpered with a flicker of amusement. And then his eyes settled on Silas. Under the coat, Ellie felt the man's cold focus like a physical touch. She held her breath until her lungs burned. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt, to run, but she was trapped, pinned by the weight of the coat and the sheer, paralyzing force of her fear. Silas did not react. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He simply sat there, his hat pulled low, his face a mask of shadow and indifference. His visible hand, the one not holding the duster closed, rested on his knee, relaxed and still. He looked less like a man being held at gunpoint and more like a man mildly inconvenienced by a delay in his journey. The leader, a man who clearly expected fear and supplication, was visibly thrown by this absolute lack of it. He took a half-step closer, his boots crunching on the dusty floor. "You in the corner, take off that hat." Time seemed to stretch, thin and taut. For a moment, Ellie was certain Silas would refuse, that a shot would ring out, and it would all be over. But then, with a movement that was unnervingly calm, Silas raised his hand and slowly, almost lazily, pushed the brim of his hat up. He lifted his head, and his eyes met the leader's, even from her hiding place. Ellie felt the shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the oppressive heat of the coach had suddenly been replaced by a chilling frost. Silas's eyes, the color of cold cinders, were completely devoid of fear. They held no anger, no defiance, nothing but a vast, empty stillness that seemed to drink the light from the air. It was the look of a man who had walked through hell and had not been impressed. The leader, a man named Barlow, faltered. He was used to breaking men, to seeing terror in their eyes. But here, there was nothing to break. He was looking into a void. His own reflection, small and brutish, was all that looked back. He held the gaze for a second longer, then broke it. A flicker of uncertainty in his own eyes. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "We're looking for a girl," Barlow grunted, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Ran off. Calico dress, brown hair. You seen her?" He directed the question to the coach at large, his eyes deliberately avoiding Silas's. The salesman shook his head vigorously. The woman, eyes wide with terror, gave a small, jerky shake of her head as well. Barlow's gaze swept the coach one last time. It lingered on Silas again, on the heavy duster that seemed too large, too warm for the weather. Suspicion warred with a primal instinct that warned him to leave this man alone. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. The girl wasn't worth a confrontation with whatever this silent man was. "All right," he said, backing toward the door. "Driver, get this heap moving, and if we find out you're lying, we'll track you down and burn this coach to the axles with you all in it." He and the second man stepped out. The door remained open. Outside, Barlow could be heard barking at the driver. "Get on with it, go." The driver's whip cracked, a sound like a gunshot, and the stagecoach lurched forward. The immediate danger seemed to have passed. Ellie felt a wave of dizzying relief wash over her, so potent it almost made her sick. She had been found and overlooked. It was a miracle. But the third man, the one who had remained outside, now leaned into the doorway as the coach began to pick up speed. He was younger than the others, with a nervous energy about him. His eyes darted around the coach, unwilling to let it go, and then he saw it. A tiny detail, almost nothing. A piece of dark thread from the hem of Ellie's torn dress had caught on the heel of Silas's boot. The young man's eyes narrowed. He looked from the thread to the bulky shape of the duster. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had found what his boss had missed. "Hey, Barlow!" he shouted, starting to climb into the moving coach. "Hold on, I think our little bird is right here, nesting in the corner." The moment the words left his mouth, Silas exploded into motion. It was not a frantic or panicked movement. It was a sudden, violent, and utterly efficient unfolding of his coiled stillness. In one seamless action, he stood, pulling Ellie up with him. Her head swam as she was yanked from the darkness into the blinding light, her legs weak and uncooperative. The young pursuer was halfway through the door, his hand reaching for them, his smile turning to a look of surprise. Silas didn't go for the door the man was blocking. He spun, shoving Ellie toward the opposite side of the coach. There was a small, locked door there, meant for luggage. Without a moment's hesitation, Silas drew his right foot back and kicked. The wood splintered with a sound like breaking bones. The lock burst from its housing, and the door flew open, revealing a dizzying blur of reddish-brown earth and spinning sky. The coach was picking up speed now, the landscape a rushing, indistinct torrent. The young pursuer lunged for them. Silas shoved Ellie through the opening without looking back. For a terrifying, weightless second, she was airborne. The wind shrieked in her ears, tearing the breath from her lungs. Then Silas was right behind her, his hand gripping her arm in a band of iron, his body shielding hers as they plummeted from the moving vehicle. They hit the ground with a force that knocked the world sideways. It was not a soft landing. It was a brutal collision of rock, sand, and flesh. They tumbled head over heels, a chaotic mess of flailing limbs and torn fabric. The world was a spinning, jarring nightmare of pain and grit. A sharp rock tore at Ellie's arm, and the impact with the ground sent a shockwave through her entire body. They finally rolled to a stop in a thicket of creosote bush and thorny scrub, a good 20 yards from the track. Dust filled Ellie's mouth and lungs. Every inch of her body ached, dazed. She lay on the ground, the world slowly coming back into focus. The stagecoach was already receding into the distance, the shouts from the pursuers growing fainter. But there was no time for rest. Silas was already on his feet, his face a grim mask of determination, miraculously unharmed save for a few scrapes. He hauled her up, his grip relentless. "Run," he said. It was the first word he had ever spoken to her. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together. And they ran. He pulled her along, his long strides eating up the harsh terrain. Ellie stumbled, her ill-fitting shoes a constant betrayal, but he never let her fall. They plunged deeper into the wilderness, away from the road, away from the world of men. The thorny branches of mesquite tore at their clothes and skin, but they didn't slow. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the rasp of their own breathing and the pounding of their hearts. They were two desperate figures swallowed by the vast, silent, and unforgiving landscape. The chase was over, but the escape had just begun. The brutal momentum of their flight gave way to the searing agony in their lungs. They ran until the shouts of their pursuers were swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert, until the only sounds were the rasp of their own breathing and the frantic drumming of their hearts. Ellie's side was a knot of fire. Every breath was a shard of glass. The ridiculous, ill-fitting shoes that had been a source of discomfort were now instruments of torture, filling with sand and rubbing her feet raw with every desperate step. Silas, running just ahead of her, his hand still a firm, guiding presence on her arm, finally slowed. He did not stop, but his pace eased from a desperate sprint to a ground-eating lope. He scanned the landscape, his ash-gray eyes taking in every detail, the direction of the faint breeze, the angle of the sun, the composition of the sparse, hardy vegetation. He was reading the land like a page from a book he knew by heart. He led her not toward the distant, hazy mountains that offered the illusion of shelter, but toward a shallow basin where the ground was thick with brittle, sun-scorched rabbit brush and dried grasses from a long-forgotten rainy season. It was a desolate, unremarkable patch of terrain. He stopped abruptly, releasing her arm. Ellie staggered to a halt, leaning forward with her hands on her knees, gasping for air. She watched, bewildered, as he knelt. From a small leather pouch on his belt, he produced a piece of flint and a small, C-shaped piece of steel. His movements were economical and precise, wasting no energy. He struck the steel against the flint, and a pathetic shower of sparks fell into the small bundle of dried grass he had gathered. Nothing happened. He struck it again, and again. Ellie watched, her mind numb with exhaustion and confusion. What was he doing, wasting precious time? On the fourth strike, a single, defiant spark landed in the heart of the tinder and glowed with a tiny, orange life. Silas lowered his head and blew on it, a soft, steady breath that was a coaxing, not a command. The ember brightened, and a thread of white smoke curled into the air. He gently added more dried grass, and suddenly, with a hungry whoosh, a small flame leaped into existence. The fire caught with an astonishing speed. The desiccated plants, starved for moisture, were perfect fuel. The flames spread, crackling and spitting, racing through the dry brush. A thick column of white smoke began to billow upward, a stark signal against the pale blue canvas of the sky. Silas stood, grabbing her arm again before she had a chance to fully process what he had done. "This way," he commanded, his voice the same low rumble as before. He pulled her away from the growing fire, moving at a right angle to their previous path, their backs to the rising smoke. The logic of his actions dawned on Ellie with the force of a physical blow. The fire was a lie. It was a signpost pointing in the wrong direction, a false trail for their pursuers. While they investigated the smoke, he and Ellie would be moving in another direction entirely, putting precious distance and confusing terrain between them. It was a simple, brilliant piece of wilderness strategy, executed with a calm efficiency that was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. A profound, unspoken realization settled over her. This silent man did not just react to the world. He imposed his will upon it. She scrambled to keep up, her admiration warring with the sheer physical misery of the effort. They moved across a plain of sharp gravel and stones that tore at the thin soles of her shoes. Finally, one of the flimsy heels caught between two rocks and snapped clean off. She cried out, stumbling and falling hard onto the unforgiving ground. Her knee struck a sharp-edged stone, and a fresh wave of pain shot up her leg. Tears of frustration and agony welled in her eyes. She couldn't go on. Her body had reached its limit. She looked down at the ruined shoes, a symbol of a life she had barely escaped, now a hindrance that could get them both killed. Without a second thought, she reached down, unbuckled the straps, and pulled them off. Her feet were a mess of blisters and raw, chafed skin, but she knew she could move more surely without them. Silas had stopped, turning to watch her. His face was unreadable in the harsh glare of the sun, but he did not rush her. He waited, his gaze fixed on her as she painfully got to her feet, the sharp gravel pressing into the tender soles of her feet. She took a tentative step, wincing, then another. It was agony, but it was a surer agony than the stumbling betrayal of the shoes. She looked at him, her chin set in a line of grim determination, and nodded. She was ready. He turned without a word and led on. His path now took them toward a jagged scar in the earth, a dry arroyo carved by the flash floods of 1,000 storms. The descent was treacherous, a steep bank of loose rock and soil. He went first, moving with the preternatural grace of a mountain goat, his boots finding purchase where there seemed to be none. He reached the bottom and looked up, waiting for her. For Ellie, the descent was a clumsy, painful slide. She clung to thorny bushes for support, her bare feet slipping and sliding, sending small avalanches of pebbles cascading down. The rocks were hot from the sun, and every step was a fresh torment. By the time she reached the bottom, her feet were bleeding, and she was trembling with exhaustion. The arroyo offered them cover. Its high, crumbling walls hid them from view, turning the vast, open desert into a narrow, winding corridor. But it was also an oven. The air was still and suffocating, the heat reflecting off the rock walls until it felt as if they were walking through a furnace. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down directly into their stone channel. There was no shade, no respite. The world became a walking nightmare of heat, pain, and thirst. Ellie's throat was a desert in itself, so dry it felt swollen shut. Her mind began to drift, her thoughts becoming a hazy, disconnected jumble of fears and memories. She focused on the only solid, real thing in her world, the back of the man in front of her. She watched the rhythmic movement of his shoulders, the steady, deliberate placement of his boots. He became her anchor, her compass. As long as he kept moving, she would keep moving. She would follow him into the heart of the sun if she had to. At one point, he stopped and pointed to a dark stain on the rock wall beneath an overhang. A tiny, almost imperceptible trickle of water, thick with minerals, seeped from a crack in the stone. It wasn't a spring, it was barely a damp patch. Silas pressed his bandana to the rock, letting it soak up the precious moisture. When it was saturated, he wrung a few drops into his palm and drank, before doing the same for her. The water was warm and tasted of rock, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was life. It was a small act of care, of provision, that spoke more than 1,000 words of comfort could have. Later, as they rounded a bend, Silas froze, his body going rigid. He threw out an arm to stop her, his eyes fixed on a patch of shade under a flat rock a few yards ahead. Ellie followed his gaze and saw it a coiled rattlesnake, its tail giving a dry, menacing buzz that sent a chill down her spine despite the heat. Silas didn't make a sound. He slowly backed away, pulling her with him, his movements calm and deliberate. They gave the snake a wide berth, climbing up the steep side of the arroyo to get around it. The danger was past in a matter of moments, but the incident reinforced her dependence on him. He saw the dangers she would have walked right into. He understood this harsh world in a way she never could. They paused in the meager shade of a high wall, and, for the first time, they looked back the way they had come, far in the distance, miles away. The plume of smoke from Silas's fire was still visible, a faint white smudge against the afternoon sky. They could hear nothing, but they could imagine the scene, the three men, angry and frustrated, circling the burning brush, searching for tracks that weren't there, cursing a ghost that had vanished into thin air. A small, triumphant smile touched Ellie's lips for the first time that day. They had fooled them. He had fooled them. The hours bled into one another. The sun began its slow descent, and the savage, white-hot light softened to gold. The temperature dropped a few degrees, and a slight breeze began to whisper down the length of the arroyo, offering a small measure of relief. Ellie was moving in a trance, a walking automaton of pain and willpower. Her feet were numb, her body a single, throbbing ache. She had long since passed the point of exhaustion and was now running on some deeper, more primal reserve of strength she never knew she possessed. Just as she felt she could not take another step, that she would simply lie down in the sand and let the desert claim her. Silas stopped. He had led them out of the arroyo and up onto a wide, flat mesa. He stood at the edge, looking down. Ellie dragged herself to his side, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She followed his gaze, and her breath caught in her throat. Below them, nestled in a small, verdant valley that seemed impossible in the midst of so much desolation, was a ranch. It was not large or grand. There was a simple, sturdy-looking cabin built of dark logs, its roof patched with sod. A small barn stood beside it, weathered to a silver gray, and a series of corrals, their fences straight and well-mended, enclosed a handful of horses. A windmill spun lazily in the breeze, and a curl of smoke, this one a friendly, welcoming gray, rose from a stone chimney on the cabin. The entire place was cradled by the gentle slopes of the valley, a hidden pocket of life and order in a world of chaos and death. It was an oasis, a sanctuary. Ellie stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. The sight of the solid cabin, the promise of water and shelter, was so overwhelming that her knees finally gave out. She sank to the ground, the last of her strength deserting her. Silas looked down at her, his expression softening for the first time. The harsh lines around his eyes seemed gentler in the twilight. He looked back at the valley, at the small, solitary homestead below. "Home," he said, the single word encompassing the entire brutal, life-saving journey. They had made it. They were safe. She woke to silence, not the heavy, watchful silence of the desert, but a deep, settled quiet that was layered with the gentle sounds of life. A soft breeze whistled faintly around the eaves of the cabin, and somewhere outside, a dove cooed its lonely, morning lament. The light that filtered through the single, unadorned window was not the harsh, white glare of yesterday, but a gentle, golden glow, softened by the valley walls. Ellie lay perfectly still, her eyes tracing the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling above her. She was in a bed, a real bed with a firm mattress stuffed with straw and a coarse but clean wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She had no memory of getting here. The last thing she recalled was the overwhelming sight of the hidden valley, the feeling of her strength giving out, and the hard ground of the mesa beneath her. Silas must have carried her. The thought sent a strange, warm flutter through her chest. Slowly, carefully, she sat up. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, a deep, resonant ache from their brutal flight. But it was the satisfying pain of survival, not the sharp sting of fear. She looked down at herself. Someone had removed her ruined stockings. Her feet, which had been a raw, bleeding mess, were clean and carefully bandaged with strips of white cloth. A small tin of foul-smelling but soothing salve sat on the simple wooden crate that served as a nightstand. This act of quiet, methodical care struck her more profoundly than the dramatic rescue. He had not just saved her from her pursuers, he had tended to her wounds, offering a gentle, unspoken comfort that was entirely at odds with his rugged, formidable presence. The cabin consisted of a single room, and from her vantage point on the bed, she could see it all. It was a man's space, Spartan and ruthlessly functional. A stone fireplace and hearth dominated one wall, with a small, cast-iron stove for cooking. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. Shelves on the wall held a few tin plates, mugs, a small collection of books, and neatly stored provisions, sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Everything was clean, ordered, and in its proper place. There was no clutter, no decoration, save for a faded map of the territory tacked to the wall. It was the home of a man who owned little and needed less, a man who found comfort in discipline and simplicity. Silas was gone. A faint, lingering warmth from the stove suggested he had been up for hours already and had left a fire for her. The silence of the cabin was absolute. She was alone. A familiar tendril of anxiety began to curl in her stomach. What now? What was expected of her? She was a stranger here, an intruder in this quiet, masculine world. She was a burden, another mouth to feed, another problem for the silent man who had already risked so much for her. The feeling of uselessness was a physical weight, pressing down on her. She couldn't just lie in his bed, consuming his food, waiting. She had to do something. She swung her legs out of bed, testing her bandaged feet on the cool, smooth wood of the floor. Walking was painful, but bearable. She found her dress draped over the back of a chair. It was still torn, but someone had brushed the worst of the dust from it. Beside it was a man's shirt, far too large for her, but clean and soft. She hesitated for only a moment before pulling it on over her chemise. It fell to her knees, the sleeves hanging well past her hands. Rolling them up, she felt a small sense of being armored, of borrowing a piece of his quiet strength. Her eyes fell upon a simple straw broom leaning in the corner by the door. And then she saw the porch. Through the open doorway, she could see the long wooden planks, covered in a fine layer of dust blown in from the high desert and tracked in by muddy boots. An idea, simple and clear. formed in her mind. It was a small thing, but it was something she could do, an act of service, a way to pay, in some minuscule fashion, for the sanctuary she had been given. She picked up the broom. It felt good in her hands, solid and purposeful. She stepped out onto the porch, into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern wall of the valley, and the world was bathed in a soft, forgiving light. The air was clean and smelled of pine and damp earth. She took a deep breath, the first truly deep breath she had taken in what felt like a lifetime, and began to sweep. The rhythmic shush, shush, shush of the bristles against the wood was a calming, meditative sound. She swept with a focused intensity, pouring all her anxious energy into the simple, repetitive task. She worked her way from one end of the porch to the other, her movements becoming more fluid and less pained as her muscles warmed. She wasn't just clearing dust, she was clearing her mind. With each stroke, she swept away the lingering fear, the memory of the chase, the faces of the men who had hunted her. She was imposing a small pocket of order on a world that had shown her only chaos. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear the soft footsteps behind her. "What are you doing?" The voice was high and clear, a child's voice, and it startled her so much she nearly dropped the broom. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Leaning against the corner of the cabin, half hidden, was a little boy. He was about 6 years old, with a thatch of blonde hair so pale it was almost white, and wide, curious blue eyes. His face was smudged with dirt, and his small hands were grimy, as if he'd been digging in the earth. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, both of which were patched and a little too big for him. Ellie stared, utterly speechless. A child. Here in this place of profound solitude, it made no sense. For a moment, she wondered if he was a figment of her imagination, a hallucination brought on by her ordeal. But he was undeniably real, his curious gaze fixed upon her. I'm sweeping," she finally managed to say, her voice husky. The boy considered this for a moment, his head tilted. "It was already swept yesterday," he stated, a matter-of-fact observation. "Silas does it every morning." A flush of embarrassment rose in Ellie's cheeks. Of course he did. This was his home, his ordered world. She had been trying to be useful, but had only managed to redo a task that was already part of a daily routine. "Oh," she said quietly, leaning the broom against the wall. "I didn't know." The boy seemed to sense her discomfort and took a tentative step closer. "My name's Tom," he offered. "What's yours?" "Ellie." "Are you staying here now?" he asked, his question devoid of anything but pure, childish curiosity. The question hung in the air between them, simple and yet impossibly complex. Was she staying here? She had no idea. I hope so, for a little while." Tom nodded, accepting this. He pointed a grubby finger toward her bandaged feet. "Did Silas fix you?" "Yes," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "He did." "He fixes lots of things," Tom said with an air of authority. "He fixed the leg on my wooden horse, and he brought me here, too." Ellie's attention sharpened. "He did?" Tom nodded vigorously, his blonde hair flopping into his eyes. "Yep, from town. I was at a bad place. Lots of yelling. Silas came and just took me. He said the air was better out here. For growing." He said the last part as if reciting something Silas had told him many times. The boy's simple, unadorned story struck Ellie with the force of a physical blow. It recontextualized everything. Silas wasn't just a quiet, solitary man. He was a rescuer, a protector. He had saved this boy from some unknown darkness in town, just as he had saved her from the men on the coach. She was not the first piece of broken humanity he had brought to this hidden valley to mend. The realization forged an instant, powerful bond of kinship between her and this small, dirty-faced boy. They were the same, 2 strays taken in from a storm. A sense of purpose, clear and bright, bloomed in Ellie's chest, chasing away the last of her anxious uncertainty. She was not a burden. She was a resident of this sanctuary, and a sanctuary needed tending. "Are you hungry, Tom?" she asked, her voice stronger now. He gave her a shy, hopeful smile and nodded again. From that moment on, Ellie moved through the day with a newfound resolve. She was clumsy at first, but she was a determined learner. She found the wood box and figured out how to feed the cast-iron stove. Coaxing the embers back to a proper fire, she discovered a small but well-stocked pantry and, after some searching, found a sack of cornmeal. She made a simple porridge, a little lumpy and a little bland, but it was warm and filling. She and Tom ate at the table, the first real meal she'd had in days that wasn't consumed in a state of terror. After they ate, Tom, now her willing guide, showed her the chicken coop behind the barn. She learned how to find the hidden nests and gather the eggs, their smooth, warm shells feeling like treasures in her hands. The quiet, contented clucking of the hens was another piece of the piece that was slowly knitting itself together inside her. She spent the afternoon in a rocking chair on the porch, a discovery that felt like the height of luxury. From Silas's mending basket, she took one of his work shirts. It had a long tear in the sleeve. With a needle and thread, she began to stitch it closed. Her stitches were small and uneven at first, but she found a rhythm. The simple, repetitive motion of the needle, like the sweeping, was a balm to her frayed nerves. As she worked, she watched Tom play in the yard, chasing lizards and talking to the horses over the corral fence. With each task, with each passing hour, a new feeling began to take shape within her. It was a feeling she had only ever dreamed of, a concept she had understood in the abstract but had never truly experienced. It was safety. Safety was not the absence of a threat. It was the presence of a routine. It was the predictable warmth of the sun on the porch. It was the solid weight of an egg in her palm. It was the sturdy log walls of the cabin that held the world at bay. It was the knowledge that a quiet, capable man was somewhere nearby, his very existence a shield against the chaos. Safety was the innocent laughter of a little boy who felt so secure he could spend his afternoon chasing lizards. As the sun began to dip below the western rim of the valley, casting long, cool shadows across the ranch, she saw him, a lone figure walking in from the pastures, his stride long and unhurried. It was Silas. Ellie's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. She watched him approach, no longer with the fearful awe of a rescued victim, but with a quiet, burgeoning sense of belonging. He walked into the sphere of warmth and life that she and the boy had maintained all day. Tom ran to meet him, babbling about his day, and Silas listened, placing a large, gentle hand on the boy's head. He looked up, and his eyes met Ellie's across the yard. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like a welcome. Ellie lowered her gaze back to the shirt in her lap, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. The day was ending. A quiet evening lay ahead, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of the dark. She was home. A quiet rhythm had settled over the small ranch, as gentle and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun over the valley rim. Days melted into a routine of simple, life-affirming tasks. Mornings were for stoking the fire, fetching water, and feeding the chickens. Afternoons were for mending, weeding the small vegetable patch Ellie had discovered behind the cabin, and listening to Tom chatter as he carved small, lopsided animals from scraps of wood. Evenings were the quietest time. They would eat supper at the simple wooden table, the three of them forming a small, unlikely family in the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. Tom, tired from a day of play, would provide a soft, rambling commentary on his adventures with lizards and horned toads. Silas would listen, his expression unreadable but his attention complete, occasionally asking the boy a quiet question that would send him off on another tangent. Ellie, for her part, was learning the art of stillness. She was learning that silence did not have to be a void filled with fear, but could be a comfortable space shared between people who understood one another without the need for constant words. On this evening, a full week after her arrival, the meal was particularly peaceful. They ate a stew she had made with salted beef and the last of the winter potatoes from the root cellar. It was a simple, hearty meal, and the cabin was filled with its comforting aroma. After supper, Silas took Tom outside to look at the stars, a nightly ritual the boy cherished. Ellie was left alone in the warm, quiet cabin, the remnants of their shared meal on the table before her. She began to clear the plates, her movements methodical and unhurried. The routine was a comfort, a shield against the memories that still haunted the edges of her mind. She carried the dishes to a large basin on a dry sink near the stove, where a kettle of water was already warm. As she worked, she was acutely aware of the debt she owed the man who had given her this peace. It was a debt that went far beyond food and shelter. He had given her a place to breathe, but she had brought danger to his doorstep, a shadow that could lengthen at any moment and engulf this small, precious world. He deserved to know the full shape of that shadow. He deserved the truth. The thought of speaking it aloud, of giving voice to the ugliness she had fled, made her hands tremble. She had spent so long running from her past that turning to face it felt like a betrayal of the instinct that had kept her alive. She feared his judgment, his pity. Most of all, she feared he would see her not as Ellie, but as a problem, a liability that would endanger the boy. She feared he would ask her to leave. Silas and Tom came back inside, their face rosy from the cool night air. Tom was half asleep, and Silas lifted the boy into his arms with an easy strength that seemed as natural as breathing. He carried him to his small cot in the corner and tucked him in, murmuring something too low for Ellie to hear. He stood for a moment, watching the boy settle into sleep, his large frame casting a long, protective shadow over the cot. When he turned back to the main room, Ellie's resolve had hardened. She could not, would not, repay his kindness with deceit. She owed him the truth, whatever the consequences. He came to the table and began wiping it down with a damp cloth, his movements as efficient and deliberate as always. Ellie stood at the sink, her hands plunged into the hot, soapy water, her back to him. The warmth of the water was a small comfort, a grounding sensation. "Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped his work, but said nothing. He simply stood, waiting, giving her the space to speak. His silence was an invitation. She took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the soapy water, unable to turn and face him. "You never asked why I was on that coach, or who those men were." The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the gentle hiss of the lamp and the soft crackle of the fire in the stove. "Didn't need to," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Saw the fear in your eyes. That was explanation enough." "It wasn't just fear," she said, scrubbing a plate with a ferocity it didn't require. "It was a promise of what was to come if they caught me." She paused, gathering her courage. "They were sent by a man my father wanted me to marry." She risked a glance over her shoulder. He was leaning against the table now, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was in shadow, but his attention was entirely on her. He was listening with that same profound stillness she had first seen in the stagecoach. "My father, he isn't a bad man," she continued, the words coming in a quiet rush now that she had started. "But he's a weak one. He made poor choices, investments that failed. He fell into debt to a man named Caleb Pike." She spoke the name as if it were a curse, a foul taste in her mouth. "Mr. Pike is powerful. He owns half the county, mines, lumber, the saloon. People are afraid of him. He has a reputation. He gets what he wants." Ellie's hands stilled in the water, and he decided he wanted me. She described him not by his physical appearance, but by the effect he had on the world around him. She spoke of his cold, flat eyes, the way men would fall silent when he entered a room, the stories that were whispered about his temper, about business partners who had disagreed with him and simply disappeared. She spoke of the day he had come to their house with her father, and how he had looked at her not as a person, but as a prize, a piece of property he was acquiring to settle a debt. My father called it a fine match. He said it would save our family. He couldn't see, or wouldn't see, the kind of man Mr. Pike was. He saw only the money, the power. He ordered me to accept. Her voice trembled, thick with the memory of her own powerlessness. I was to be his wife, another one of his possessions. I saw my whole life laid out before me, a long, dark room with no windows and no doors. I knew with a certainty that went bone deep, that the man was cruel, that his kindness was a mask for a deep and chilling brutality. I knew he would break me, slowly and deliberately, just for the sport of it. She fell silent, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the basin. The story was laid bare between them in the quiet cabin, ugly and undeniable. The night before I was to give him my answer. I ran, she whispered. I took what little money I had, a few coins I'd saved. I climbed out my window and just ran. I bought a ticket for the first stagecoach heading west, thinking I could disappear. But a man like Caleb Pike doesn't forgive an insult. It's not about me. It's about his pride. He can't abide something he owns defying him. So he sent those men, and he'll keep sending them. She finished, her story told. A great, shuddering sigh escaped her, as if she had been holding her breath for a week. She stood, braced for his response, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The silence that followed was absolute. She expected questions. She expected anger for the danger she had brought upon him and Tom. She expected, most of all, the quiet, final words telling her it was time to leave. She heard his boots shift on the wooden floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, not wanting to see the verdict on his face, but he didn't speak. Instead of words, there was only movement. He walked from the table to the small stack of clean, wet plates she had placed in a drying rack beside the basin. He picked up a dry, clean dishcloth from a hook on the wall, and then he was standing beside her. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The space was small, and their shoulders were only an inch apart. She opened her eyes and watched as he took the top plate from the rack and began to dry it with slow, deliberate circular motions. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the simple task in his hands. He dried the first plate, its surface gleaming in the lamplight, and placed it on the shelf. He took the second one. He kept working, his movements calm and rhythmic, falling into a silent partnership with her. She washed, he dried. The simple domestic act was a response more powerful and profound than any words could ever be. It was not pity. It was not judgment. It was acceptance. It was solidarity. Standing side by side in the warm, small space, their hands engaged in the same mundane task. He was telling her everything she needed to know without saying a single word. He was telling her that her past was now part of the house, a truth that could be acknowledged and lived with. He was telling her she was not a liability to be discarded, but a person to be stood beside. He was telling her she was not alone. Ellie's vision blurred with unshed tears, but these were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of a deep and overwhelming gratitude. She turned her attention back to the basin, washing the last of the mugs, her movements now in sync with his. The quiet sounds of their work, the soft splash of water, the gentle rasp of the cloth against ceramic filled the cabin. For the first time since she had climbed out her window weeks ago, the knot of fear that had lived permanently in her stomach began to loosen its hold. The truth was out. The past had been spoken, and the world had not ended. Instead, a silent, steady man had simply picked up a dishcloth and stood beside her in the quiet heart of his home. The confession, once spoken, did not linger in the air like a foul smoke. Instead, Its release seemed to cleanse the quiet spaces of the cabin, sweeping out the last vestiges of doubt and suspicion. A new kind of silence settled between Ellie and Silas in the days that followed. It was no longer the silence of strangers sharing a roof, nor the watchful silence of a protector and his ward. It had become a language in its own right, a deep and resonant quiet built on a foundation of shared truth. He did not treat her with pity or handle her like a fragile, broken thing. He was the same as he had always been, methodical, reserved, and economical with his words. Yet, something had shifted in the way he looked at her. The unreadable gray of his eyes now held a new depth, a current of profound understanding that flowed beneath the still surface. Ellie, in turn, felt the tight, protective shell she had inhabited for so long begin to soften. The constant, low-grade hum of fear that had been the soundtrack to her life was fading, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic pulse of the ranch. She moved with a lighter step, her shoulders losing their defensive hunch. She was no longer just a survivor hiding from the world. She was a participant in this small, ordered life. She found a genuine pleasure in the simple, repetitive tasks, the warmth of new bread pulled from the stove, the clean, earthy smell of laundry dried under the vast desert sun, the satisfaction of a perfectly mended seam. One afternoon, while returning from the well with 2 heavy buckets of water, she paused by the fence that bordered the horse corral. There, growing in defiance of the hard-packed, dusty earth, was a single, stubborn wildflower. It was a desert marigold, its head a riot of brilliant, sunny yellow against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. It was not a grand or delicate bloom. It was hardy, resilient, a small, fierce testament to the power of life to flourish in the most unforgiving of places. She set the buckets down and knelt, drawn to this small splash of color. It reminded her of herself, or perhaps of the person she hoped she was becoming, a thing that could not only endure the harshness of the world, but could find a way to bloom in it, on a pure, unthinking impulse. She reached out and gently plucked the flower from its stem. She held it in her palm, its vibrant yellow a stark contrast to the calluses and scrapes on her own skin. It was a small, perfect moment of beauty, and she felt an overwhelming urge to share it, to bring this small piece of wild hope inside the sturdy log walls of the cabin. But how? The thought of walking up to Silas and handing it to him was mortifying. It felt too bold, too personal, a gesture freighted with meanings she wasn't ready to examine. Their communication was one of silent action, not offerings. So, instead, she carried it back to the cabin and, after a moment's thought, placed it in a simple tin cup she filled with water, setting it on the windowsill by the door. It was an anonymous gift to the house itself, a small splash of color to brighten the Spartan room. It was her way of saying thank you, a silent acknowledgement of the beauty she was beginning to find in this new life. She went about her afternoon chores, trying to put the flower out of her mind. Yet she found herself casting nervous glances toward the door, waiting for Silas to return from his work. She felt a ridiculous, childish anxiety. Would he even notice it? Or if he did, would he think it a frivolous, useless gesture and simply toss it out? He came in as the sun began to dip low, filling the valley with a soft, golden light. He was dusty and tired. As always, he took off his hat and hung it on its peg by the door, then paused. His gaze fell upon the yellow flower in the tin cup. Ellie, who was kneading dough at the table, held her breath. She watched as he looked at it for a long, silent moment. His face, etched with the lines of sun and hardship, was completely unreadable. He did not smile, did not frown. He simply looked. Then, without a word, he turned away and went to the basin to wash the day's grime from his hands and face. A small, sharp pang of disappointment went through Ellie. He had seen it, but it had meant nothing to him. It was just a weed in a cup. She felt foolish, as if she had tried to speak in a language he did not understand. She turned her attention back to her dough, punching it down with more force than was necessary, her small gesture of hope seemingly unnoticed and unappreciated. Later that evening, the cabin was quiet again. Tom was asleep on his cot, his breathing soft and even. A single lamp burned on the table, casting a warm, intimate circle of light in the center of the room. Ellie sat in the rocking chair, mending one of Tom's shirts, the gentle creak of the runners a soothing rhythm in the stillness. Silas sat at the table, not reading as he sometimes did, but with a small, leather-bound book open before him. From its appearance, it looked like a ledger or a journal, its pages filled with his neat, angular script. Ellie watched him from under her lashes. She saw him glance toward the windowsill where the flower still stood. Then he rose from the table and walked to the door. He picked up the tin cup and brought it back to the table, handling it with a surprising lack of his usual brusque efficiency. He lifted the single, perfect marigold from the water, holding it carefully by its stem. For a moment, he simply looked at it, turning it over in his large, calloused fingers, the vibrant yellow a stark jewel against his weathered skin. Then he opened the book again, with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the man she knew. He carefully laid the flower onto a blank page. He took another page and folded it over the top, then slowly closed the book, his hand resting on the leather cover for a long moment, pressing down. Ellie's heart seemed to stop. She sat frozen in the rocking chair, the shirt and needle forgotten in her lap. The moment was so private, so intensely personal. She felt as if she were intruding on something sacred. He hadn't ignored the flower. He hadn't dismissed it as a silly weed. He had understood. He had recognized it for what it was, a small offering of beauty, a symbol of hope. And he had not just accepted it. He had preserved it. He had taken her small, transient gesture and made it permanent, pressing it into the pages of his own private world. The realization washed over her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. The next day, the sun was warm and the air was clear. After her morning chores, Ellie took her mending basket and went to her favorite spot. It was a place she had discovered a few days earlier, a large, flat-topped boulder that rested in the shade of a solitary cottonwood tree near the creek. It was her place of quiet contemplation, where the only sounds were the rustle of the leaves and the gentle murmur of the water. She would sit there for an hour or so in the afternoons, the sun-warmed stone at her back, and feel the last of her anxieties drift away on the breeze. But when she arrived at her spot today, she stopped short. Something was different. On top of the boulder, exactly where she always sat, was a piece of soft, tanned sheepskin, its fleece side up, folded neatly to form a perfect cushion against the hard stone. And beside it, resting on a flat section of the rock, was a tin cup filled to the brim with water, so cool that a fine mist of condensation had formed on its metallic side. Ellie stood motionless, her mending basket hanging forgotten from her hand. It was an unmistakable message. It was his reply. There were no words, no grand declarations, only this simple, profound evidence of his care. He had paid attention. He had noticed where she went in the afternoons. He had seen her sitting on the hard, bare rock and had thought to make it more comfortable for her. He had anticipated her thirst and brought her a cool drink. This small, thoughtful act was more intimate, more deeply moving than any poem or profession of love could ever be. It was a gesture born of quiet observation and a deep, unspoken tenderness. It was care, translated into its purest, most elemental form. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her knees weak washed over her. The final, tightly locked gate around her heart, the one she had kept barred against the world for so long, finally swung open. She understood now. The safety she felt here was not just about sturdy walls and a lack of immediate threat. It was about this silent, steady, and profound attentiveness. This was a man who spoke not with his mouth, but with his hands, with his actions. He had built a fortress of safety around her, not with guns and threats, but with bandaged feet, a shared meal, a dried dishcloth, a pressed flower, and a cup of cool water. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the simple offering on the rock. She walked forward and gently touched the soft sheepskin. She sat down, the cushion a small luxury against the hard stone. She picked up the cup, its coolness a balm against her warm hands, and took a long, slow drink. The water was crisp and clean, tasting of the deep, pure earth from which it had been drawn, and, as she drank, she looked out over the peaceful valley that had become her sanctuary, her home. She finally understood. She didn't need to hear the words. In the quiet language of this place, everything that mattered was already being said. The weeks that followed Ellie's confession had been a quiet, gentle gift. The fragile bud of trust that had formed between her and Silas blossomed in the peaceful solitude of the valley. Their shared language of silence was now punctuated by small, shared smiles and the easy, comfortable rhythm of a life lived in tandem. Love, she was discovering, was not a lightning strike or a thunderclap. It was the slow, steady warmth of a hearth fire. It was the quiet confidence of knowing another person's presence without needing to see them. It was the way Silas would leave a bucket of fresh water on the porch for her in the afternoons, and the way she would mend a tear in his shirt before he even knew it was there. This evening, the peace was so deep it felt as if it had settled into the very timbers of the cabin. The sun had bled out behind the western ridge, leaving the sky a bruised purple and painting the valley in soft, forgiving shadows. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the sweet scent of hay from the barn. Inside, the cabin was a pocket of golden warmth against the encroaching dusk. A savory stew simmered on the stove, and Tom was sitting at the table, chattering happily as he showed Silas a newly carved figure of a horse, this one with the legs that were almost the same length. Ellie watched them from the hearth, a soft, genuine smile on her face. She felt a sense of belonging so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. This was home. This was family. The ugly, fearful world she had escaped from felt 1,000,000 miles away. A bad dream from another lifetime. It was the horses that gave the first warning. A sudden, nervous whinny from the corral, sharp and high-pitched, cut through the evening calm. It was followed by an uneasy silence where the usual soft nickering should have been. Silas went still. The gentle expression on his face as he listened to Tom vanished, replaced by a mask of honed, lethal alertness. He did not move, but every line of his body went rigid. He was a predator that had scented danger on the wind. "Tom," he said, his voice low and calm, but with an undercurrent of steel that made Ellie's blood run cold. "Go to your room." "But my horse," the boy started to protest. "Now," Silas said, the single word cutting off any argument. He rose from his chair in one fluid motion, his hand drifting down to rest near the butt of the revolver holstered on his hip. His eyes met Ellie's across the room, and in them, she saw the quiet, peaceful man disappear, replaced by the deadly survivor from the desert. The dream was over. The outside world had found them. A heavy, booted footstep sounded on the porch, followed by another. It was too heavy to be a wandering animal. It was the sound of men who were not trying to be quiet. "Ellie," Silas said, his voice a low command. "Get behind me. Take the boy." Ellie moved without thinking, her body responding to the primal urgency in his voice. She grabbed Tom's small hand, pulling him from his chair and shoving him behind her as they backed away toward the relative safety of the kitchen alcove. The cabin door did not open. It exploded. It flew inward with a deafening crash of splintering wood, torn from its leather hinges by a single, violent kick. 3 figures filled the doorway, dark silhouettes against the dying light. They were gaunt and grimy, their faces hardened by a long and fruitless search, their eyes burning with a hateful, vindictive light. The man in the lead was Barlow, his face which Ellie remembered as merely cruel, was now twisted into a mask of pure malice. "Evening, friend," Barlow snarled. Stepping into the cabin, he held a long, wicked-looking knife in one hand. The two men who fanned out behind him were armed with pistols. "We were just passing through, looking for something that belongs to our employer." Silas had not drawn his weapon. He stood in the center of the room, a solid, unmovable obstacle between the intruders and his family. "You've got no business here," he said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "Turn around and walk away, and you might live to see the sunrise." Barlow laughed. "A short, ugly bark. I don't think so. We've come a long way. We aim to collect the girl and a little extra for our trouble." The fight, when it came, was not a drawn-out duel. It was a sudden, brutal explosion of violence in the confined space. Barlow lunged, his knife flashing. The other two men raised their pistols, but Silas moved with a speed that was almost supernatural. He drew his revolver, and a deafening roar filled the cabin. A blast of fire and smoke that sent one of the men staggering backward with a cry of pain. Before the second man could fire, Silas was on him, striking him across the face with the heavy barrel of his gun. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the man crumpled to the floor. It was 2 against 1. Barlow, seeing his men fall, came at Silas with a feral roar, his knife a silver blur. Ellie watched in frozen terror, clutching a trembling Tom to her side. The world had devolved into a nightmare of crashing furniture, guttural shouts, and the terrifying glint of steel. Silas was a force of nature, parrying the knife thrusts with his forearm, his fists landing with the heavy, sickening thud of a blacksmith's hammer. But as he fought with Barlow, the first man he had shot, clutching a wounded shoulder, staggered to his feet. He raised his pistol, his face a mask of agony and rage. "Silas, behind you!" Ellie screamed, the words tearing from her throat. Silas heard her. He shoved Barlow away and started to turn, his gun coming around, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The man didn't fire. Instead, he swung the heavy pistol like a club. The steel barrel caught Silas high on the side of the head with a sickening, wet thud. Silas's eyes went wide for a moment, a look of pure surprise on his face. Then his body went limp. He fell like a great tree, crashing to the floor with a finality that shook the entire cabin. He lay still, his face in the dust. A sound, a terrible, wounded cry, escaped Ellie's lips. The world stopped. Her protector, her anchor, her quiet, steady rock, was gone. Barlow stood over Silas's still form, panting, a triumphant, savage grin spreading across his face. He nudged Silas's body with the toe of his boot. "Not so tough now. Are you, hero?" Ellie's mind was a maelstrom of pure, white-hot terror. With Silas down, there was nothing and no one to stand between them and these animals. Her only instinct, the only clear thought that cut through the panic, was Tom. She scooped the boy into her arms. He was unnervingly light, his body rigid with silent, uncomprehending fear. She scrambled backward, deeper into the alcove, and found the small, dark space behind the large cast-iron stove. She squeezed into it, pulling Tom with her, trying to make them both invisible. The space was cramped and suffocating. It smelled of soot and old grease. She could feel the boy's small heart hammering against her own, his silent tears soaking the front of her dress. "Well, well, what have we here?" Barlow's voice was a low, mocking purr. His boots crunched on the floorboards as he approached. "Come on out, little bird. The game is over." Ellie held Tom tighter, pressing a hand over his mouth to stifle the terrified sobs that were beginning to rack his small body. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for a miracle, for the world to simply end. A large, rough hand reached into their hiding place and grabbed a fistful of Tom's shirt. Ellie cried out as Barlow dragged the boy from her arms, pulling him out into the lamplight. "Let him go!" she shrieked, scrambling out after them. Barlow ignored her. He held the terrified, struggling boy in front of him like a shield. He brought the tip of his long, sharp knife up, pressing the flat of the cold blade against the side of Tom's throat. The boy froze, a small, choked whimper his only sound. "He's a beautiful boy," Barlow said, his voice silky and low. "Be ashamed to mar him. Now, you're going to come with me. Nice and quiet, and if you give me any trouble at all." He let the threat hang in the air, the meaning made hideously clear by the knife still resting against the child's skin. Ellie stared, her mind snapping into a strange, terrifying clarity. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else was rising to meet it. It was a white-hot, protective fury so intense it burned away everything else. This man had invaded her home. He had struck down the man she loved. And now he was threatening a child, this innocent boy who had been given a second chance at life in this very valley. The gentle, quiet girl who had swept the porch and mended shirts was gone. In her place was something primal, something fierce. She was no longer a victim. She was a defender. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, for anything. And then she saw it, lying on the floor, not 5 feet from where Silas had fallen, was his revolver. It must have been knocked from his hand when he was struck. It lay in the dust, its dark, polished wood and blued steel seeming to absorb the lamplight, a dense, potent instrument of death in the center of the chaos. Barlow was distracted, his attention focused on controlling the terrified boy. He was watching Ellie, a smug, confident sneer on his face, certain of his victory. He didn't see the gun. He didn't see the change in her eyes. Without a second thought, Ellie moved. She lunged forward, not toward Barlow, but toward the gun. She snatched it from the floor, her fingers closing around the worn wooden grip. It was shockingly heavy, a solid, brutal weight in her hand, a weight she had never imagined holding. She straightened up, her movements no longer clumsy or fearful, but filled with a deadly purpose. She raised the gun with both hands to steady its unfamiliar weight, the long barrel wavering only slightly. She aimed it directly at Barlow's chest. He saw her then. His smug sneer faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing in rage. The knife was still at Tom's throat, but the balance of power in the room had just irrevocably shifted. The cornered dove had just revealed the talons of a hawk. "Put the gun down, girl," Barlow hissed, his voice losing its confident edge. Ellie's hands trembled, but her resolve was a column of iron. Her gaze was steady, her finger finding the cold, curved steel of the trigger. In the terrifying, ringing silence of the cabin, the only sound was the loud, metallic click as she pulled back the hammer. The world had shrunk to the space between Ellie's trembling hands and the man who held a child's life on the edge of a knife. The revolver was an anchor of impossible weight, pulling her down into a moment so sharp and clear it felt like the whole of her life had been leading to it. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked was the loudest sound she had ever heard, a sound that severed the past from the future. Before the click, she was a girl who ran. After, she was a woman who stood her ground. Barlow's sneer tightened, but a flicker of genuine uncertainty entered his eyes. He had dealt with frightened women his entire life. He knew how to break them, how to use their fear as a weapon against them. But this was something new. The girl's eyes, which should have been wide with terror, were narrowed into points of fierce, unyielding light. The fear was there, he could see it in the tremor of her hands, in the pallor of her skin, but it was being burned away by a cold, white-hot rage that he had not anticipated. "Think you can use that girl?" he taunted, his voice a low, menacing growl. He gave Tom a little shake, pressing the knife just a fraction closer. The boy let out a choked sob. "Think you can hit me before I open him up? Your hand is shaking so bad you're like to shoot the boy yourself." Every word was a poisoned dart, designed to make her doubt, to make her falter. But his taunts had the opposite effect. The sight of Tom's terror, The casual cruelty in Barlow's voice only solidified the column of iron in her spine. She was no longer thinking. She was pure, primal instinct. Her world had a single, clear purpose: to protect the child in front of her and the man lying broken behind her. "Let him go," she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. It was low, raspy, and devoid of the tremor that racked her body. It was a sound of absolute finality. The standoff was a frozen tableau in the chaotic, lamp-lit cabin. The intruder with his hostage, the girl with the gun, the two unconscious forms on the floor. It was a moment stretched taut as a wire, ready to snap with the slightest pressure. And then, a new element entered the scene. A shadow fell across the broken doorway. A large, stooped figure that blocked out the last of the evening's purple light. A floorboard on the porch creaked under a heavy weight. Barlow's eyes flickered toward the sound, his concentration broken for a fatal second. An old man stepped into the cabin. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and sun-scorched leather, a cascade of white hair falling from under a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with the slow, deliberate shuffle of old age, but in his gnarled hands, he held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles like two dark, hollow eyes staring directly into Barlow's soul. It was Raoul, the old ranch hand who lived in a small cabin a quarter-mile down the creek, a man so quiet and reclusive that Ellie had only seen him from a distance. The first gunshot must have summoned him, a slow-moving but inevitable force of loyalty. "You heard the girl," Raoul said, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. "Let the boy go." Barlow was trapped. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by the feral look of a cornered coyote. He was now facing a shotgun at his back and a revolver to his front. His eyes darted between Ellie and the old man, calculating his odds. They were 0. In a last, desperate act of spite and fury, he made his move. He was not going to surrender. With a roar, he shoved Tom violently to the floor and lunged, not at Raoul, but at Ellie. He thought she was the weaker target, the girl who was only pretending to be brave. He was wrong. The moment Tom was clear, the moment the threat to the boy was removed, Ellie's mind went silent. The wavering sight on the end of the barrel steadied. The taunts, the fear, the trembling, it all vanished, leaving behind only a single, cold point of action. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. It was a deafening, apocalyptic roar that seemed to rip the world in two, a sound so immense it dwarfed everything that had come before. The revolver leaped in her hands with a violent, upward kick that tore through her arms and shoulders. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder instantly filled the air, acrid and choking. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but noise and recoil and a blinding flash of orange fire from the muzzle. She did not know where the bullet went. She had not aimed for a specific point on his body, but for the center of the threat he represented. She saw Barlow cry out, a sound that was half rage and half pain, as he stumbled sideways, clutching at his arm where the heavy slug had torn through flesh and muscle. He stared at her, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. The girl had actually fired. The bluff was no bluff at all. Before he could recover, the deep, thunderous boom of Raoul's shotgun echoed through the valley, a sound that was less a gunshot and more a judgment. The blast tore a chunk of wood from the doorframe just inches from Barlow's head, showering him with splinters. That was enough. Terror finally broke through his rage. He scrambled backward, grabbing his other conscious, wounded comrade by the collar and dragging him toward the door. "This isn't over," he screamed, his voice raw with pain and fury, a desperate, hollow threat. And then they were gone, two figures swallowed by the darkness, leaving a wake of destruction and a profound, ringing silence. The immediate aftermath was a strange, suspended moment in time. The air was thick with smoke, hazy in the lamplight. The scent of gunpowder was overpowering. Ellie stood in the center of the room, the heavy revolver still held out in front of her, her arms locked and trembling from the strain. Her ears rang. The world felt distant, muffled. Then, a small sound broke the spell. A whimper. "Tom," she breathed. The gun fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering loudly on the wooden floor. She ran to the boy, who was huddled on the floor where Barlow had thrown him, his small body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She gathered him into her arms, pulling him onto her lap, burying her face in his soft, blonde hair. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's over. You're safe. I've got you. You're safe." She rocked him back and forth, murmuring the words over and over, as much for herself as for him. He clung to her, his small hands clutching her dress, his fear a tangible thing against her chest. Raoul shuffled over, his shotgun now held loosely in one hand. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ellie looked up at the old man, tears now streaming freely down her face, carving clean paths through the soot and grime on her cheeks. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. And then her eyes fell on Silas. He was still lying where he had fallen, a dark, unmoving shape on the floor. A cold dread, far more terrifying than the fear she had felt during the fight, seized her heart. The adrenaline that had sustained her, the fury that had given her strength, all of it drained away, leaving her hollow and weak. "Silas," she whispered. She gently set Tom aside and crawled across the floor to him, her hands clumsy, her movements frantic. Raoul knelt beside them, his old face grim. She reached out a trembling hand, afraid of what she would find. She touched his neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. Then, she felt it, a slow, steady beat, thready, but there. He was alive. "Silas," she pleaded, her voice breaking. She brushed the hair back from his face. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming on his temple where the pistol barrel had struck him. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Silas, please, please wake up. Open your eyes. Please, Silas." She leaned her head down on his chest, her ear pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt, listening to the slow, reassuring rhythm of his heart. She wrapped her arms around him, as if she could pour her own life and warmth into his still form. "Don't leave me," she sobbed, the words muffled against his chest. "Please don't leave me. I can't do this without you. I love you. Please wake up." She lay there for a long moment, the world a misery of grief and fear. She had won the fight only to lose everything that mattered. The cabin, her sanctuary, was a wreck. The man who had built it, who was its heart and soul, was broken at her feet. And then she felt it, a flicker of movement beneath her cheek, a slight tensing of the muscles in his chest, a low sound, not a word, but a deep, guttural groan of pain. She lifted her head, her eyes wide. Silas. His eyelids fluttered. His hand, which had been lying limp on the floor, twitched, the fingers curling slightly. He groaned again, a sound of someone fighting their way up from a deep, dark place. A strangled, hysterical sound that was half sob, half laugh, escaped Ellie's lips. He was alive. He was waking up. The darkness that had been about to swallow her whole receded, banished by the faintest flicker of his consciousness. She collapsed beside him, her forehead resting on his shoulder, and wept. But these were no longer the tears of terror or grief. They were the tears of a desperate, overwhelming, and miraculous relief. The battle was over. Her world had been torn apart, but its center, against all odds, was holding. The chaotic, violent energy of the attack receded, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and brittle. In its wake, the world shrank to the four walls of the log cabin, and time itself seemed to slow, measured now in the shallow breaths of the wounded man in the bed. With Raoul's help, they had managed to move Silas from the floor to his own cot, the site of the man who had carried her from the mesa, now a dead weight and utterly dependent on their strength. was a stark and terrifying reversal. Raoul, his face grim, had cleaned the wound on Silas's head as best he could. It was an ugly, deep gash, swollen and bruised. But the skull, he'd declared with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of violence, did not seem to be broken. "He's got a hard head," the old man had rasped, though his eyes betrayed a deep worry. "But a blow like that can curdle a man's senses. He'll need watching, day and night." And so Ellie's vigil began. The first 48 hours were a waking nightmare, a blur of fear and exhaustion. Silas did not wake. He drifted in a deep, dark sea of unconsciousness, his body sometimes burning with fever, his breath at other times so shallow she would press her ear to his lips just to be sure he was still alive. Her world became a small, repeating circle of tasks, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, forcing drops of water between his cracked lips, changing the dressing on his wound, and simply sitting, watching, and praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. She did not sleep. She dozed in a chair by his bedside, her body slumping with exhaustion, only to be jerked awake by a feverish murmur or a sudden shift in his breathing. Tom, subdued and quiet, became her little shadow, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a wide-eyed solemnity. He would fetch cloths for her, or sit at the foot of the bed, a silent, tiny guard. Raoul took over the essential ranch chores, his steady, quiet presence on the periphery a small comfort, a sign that the world outside the sick room had not entirely ceased to exist. On the third day, the fever broke. Ellie woke from a brief, troubled doze to find his eyes open, not focused or truly seeing, but open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they were the eyes of a man who was fighting his way back to the surface. A wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over her. From that point on, his recovery was a slow, arduous journey, and she was his constant, unwavering guide. His strength was gone. The man who could fell a tree with an axe and leap from a moving stagecoach could not lift his own head from the pillow. In this profound weakness, a new, fragile intimacy was born between them. She fed him thin broth and watery cornmeal gruel, spoonful by careful spoonful. The first time she did it, a flush of awkwardness and a profound sense of tenderness brought tears to her eyes. To see this fiercely independent man so utterly helpless, so dependent on her for his very sustenance, was to see the final wall of his stoicism crumble away. He would meet her eyes as she fed him, and in his gaze, she saw not shame, but a deep, aching vulnerability and a silent, overwhelming gratitude. When his mind grew clearer but his body was still a prison, she began to read to him. There were only a handful of books on his shelf, a Bible, a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, and a slim volume of poetry. She read in a low, steady voice, the words filling the quiet cabin for hours on end. She read him psalms of comfort and sonnets of love, her voice a constant, soothing thread that seemed to stitch the frayed edges of his consciousness back together. He would lie with his eyes closed, listening, his hands sometimes twitching on the blanket as if reaching for the words. For her. The nights were the hardest. The darkness seemed to magnify his weakness and her fear. He would grow restless, his head thrashing on the pillow, his sleep troubled by nightmares of the fight, his hands clenching into fists. It was during one of these long, dark nights that she first took his hand. It was a simple, instinctive gesture. His hand, so large and calloused, felt surprisingly lax in hers. She held it, her small fingers intertwined with his, and felt a tremor run through him, and then a profound stillness. He settled, his breathing evening out. Her touch was an anchor in his troubled sea. From then on, she held his hand every night, a silent, steadfast guardian against the shadows. A week after the attack, he was able to speak, his voice a raw, weak version of its former self. His sentences were short, his mind still clouded by a persistent headache that kept him confined to the bed. But he was present. He was Silas again. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, his gray eyes following her with an intensity that spoke volumes. He watched her tend the fire, cook for Tom, mend his own torn clothing. He watched as the girl he had rescued transformed completely into the fierce, capable heart of his home. One evening, the lamp was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Tom was fast asleep. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound. Silas was restless, his brows furrowed with pain. Ellie sat by his bed, holding his hand, its familiar weight a comfort to them both. She looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between her smooth skin and his rough, scarred knuckles. She thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the dusty stagecoach, the desperate flight, the shared fear, the battle in this very room. She thought of the revolver, its shocking weight in her hands, the deafening roar of the shot she had fired. A strange, quiet realization settled over her. The terror that had been her constant companion for so long was gone. It had been burned out of her in the heat of that final, violent confrontation. It had been replaced by something harder, something stronger. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. It was not a declaration meant to soothe him. It was a simple statement of a newly discovered truth about herself. The world was still a dangerous place. Caleb Pike and his monsters were still out there, but the fear no longer owned her. She had faced the worst, and she had not broken. She had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. Right here in this cabin, the fear of what lay outside these walls was nothing compared to the strength she had found within them. Silas did not answer. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her, his gaze clear and deep in the dim light. He couldn't speak the words, his mind still too slow and his throat too raw. But he didn't need to. He simply tightened his grip on her hand. It was a small, weak movement, but it was filled with more meaning than 1,000 words. It was an acknowledgement of her strength. It was a recognition of their shared survival. It was an answer. In the quiet, slow-paced days of his healing, love bloomed. It was not the fragile, fleeting blossom of her earlier imaginings. This love was a hardy, resilient desert flower, born of shared trauma and watered with selfless care. It grew in the long, silent hours they spent together, in the spaces between the words she read and the spoonfuls of broth he accepted. It was in the way his eyes would find hers across the room, a silent question of her well-being that had nothing to do with his own. It was in the way she would fluff his pillow, her touch lingering on his shoulder for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was in the way Tom would crawl onto the bed and lay his head on Silas's chest, and Silas, with great effort, would lift his arm to rest it across the boy's back, the three of them a silent, perfect portrait of a family forged in fire. This love was not a sudden flame. It was the slow, deliberate building of a fire, piece by careful piece. The kindling was their shared rescue. The logs were the long days of her vigil and his slow recovery. The spark was the moment she had picked up his gun to defend their home, and now it was burning. Not a wild, consuming inferno, but a steady, constant, and profoundly warm flame in the center of their hearts, a light that held the darkness at bay. It was a fire built to last, a quiet promise of a new dawn they had earned together. Summer settled into the valley, not with the brutal, scorching heat of the high desert, but with a gentle, life-giving warmth. The land, which had been a witness to violence and fear, was now a testament to resilience. The creek ran full and clear. The cottonwood leaves whispered in the afternoon breeze, and the patch of desert marigolds by the corral fence had spread into a defiant, joyful blaze of yellow. The ranch had not just survived the assault. It was healing, and its slow, steady recovery was a mirror of the three souls who called it home. Silas's strength returned day by day, a tide coming back in after a long and frightening ebb. The ugly gash on his head had healed into a thin, pale scar. a permanent reminder of the moment their world had almost been extinguished. At first, his movements were slow, cautious, his balance uncertain, but soon he was walking the fence line, his long strides regaining their old, familiar rhythm. He began to work again, the resonant thud of his axe and the steady ring of his hammer against fence posts becoming the valley's new heartbeat. The work was his medicine, a way to reclaim his body and his purpose. But something in him was irrevocably changed. The profound stillness was still there, but it was no longer a shield against the world. It was now a deep, calm reservoir of peace. The ash in his eyes had been rekindled, and in their gray depths, a warm, steady light now burned whenever he looked at Ellie. Tom, who had been a silent, haunted shadow in the days following the attack, had his laughter restored by the summer sun. He was a whirlwind of boyish energy, his bare feet dusty, his pockets filled with smooth stones and the molted feathers of hawks. He followed Silas everywhere, a loyal and chattering apprentice, handing him nails and asking 1,000 questions. But he was never far from Ellie. He would bring her offerings a strange, twisted root, a vibrant wildflower, a perfectly round pebble, and she would accept them with the gravity of a queen receiving tribute. The terror of that night had bound them together, forging a bond that was a unique mixture of mother and son, of fellow survivors. She was his safety, and he was her joy. And Ellie herself had been reborn. The timid, frightened girl who had stumbled onto the stagecoach was a distant memory, a ghost from another life. In her place stood a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. The rhythms of the ranch were now her own. Her hands, once soft and unaccustomed to labor, were now capable and sure. She could bake bread, milk the single cow Raoul had brought over, and stitch a seam as straight as any tailor. But the change was more than just a mastery of new skills. It was a change in her very bearing. She walked with her head held high, her gaze direct and clear. The fear was gone, and in its place was a deep, unshakable sense of belonging. This land, this cabin, these two souls, they were hers, and she was theirs. Her love for Silas was not a fragile, whispered thing anymore. It was as solid and real as the log walls of the cabin, as life-giving as the water from the creek. It was in every meal she cooked, every shirt she mended, every cool cup of water she brought to him as he worked under the afternoon sun. This evening was the culmination of that long, quiet summer of healing. A gentle breeze, a welcome reprieve from the day's heat, drifted down from the high mesas, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. The sun had set, and the sky was a vast, velvety expanse of indigo pricked with the first shy stars. The three of them sat on the porch, a familiar ritual. The day's work was done. A single kerosene lamp on the small table between them cast a warm, golden circle of light, a bastion against the gathering darkness. It hissed softly, a comforting, domestic sound. Tom, leaning his head sleepily against Ellie's side, was pointing up at the sky. "That one's the coyote," he said, his small finger tracing an imaginary line between three bright stars. "And that one's Raoul's old mule." Silas, leaning back in his chair, a position of relaxed comfort that would have been impossible for him just a few months ago, let out a low chuckle. "I think you might be right, Tom." The sound, rich and genuine, warmed Ellie to her soul. She rested her cheek on the top of Tom's head, her heart full to the point of overflowing. This was it. This was the peace she had never even known how to dream of. It was a simple, profound moment of ordinary happiness, made all the more precious by the violence and terror that had preceded it. They were not just survivors. They were a family. Soon, Tom's sleepy observations trailed off into a soft, contented sigh, and his breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. After a few minutes, Silas rose and gently lifted the boy into his arms. He carried him inside and tucked him into his cot, his movements filled with a practiced, paternal tenderness. Ellie remained on the porch, her gaze drifting from the star-dusted sky to the dark, silent silhouette of the valley walls that enclosed them. These walls were no longer a symbol of isolation, but of protection. This valley was not a cage. It was a sanctuary, a world they had built and defended together. When Silas returned, he didn't sit back down. He stood by the railing, looking out into the same darkness, his broad shoulders framed by the doorway. He was a man at peace in his own domain. Ellie rose and went to stand beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They stood in comfortable silence, their shoulders almost touching, sharing the quiet beauty of the night. The gentle breeze stirred a loose strand of her hair, and she felt more than saw. His gaze turned to her. It was a look of such profound love and quiet contentment that it made her breath catch in her throat. After a long, peaceful moment, he turned to go inside. "Getting late," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. She nodded and followed him into the warm, lamp-lit cabin. He went to the small shelf where a few precious tallow candles were kept. He took one, a simple, hand-dipped stick of wax, and lit its wick from the chimney of the kerosene lamp. The small, new flame sputtered to life, a tiny, personal star in his hand. His intention was simple and practical: to carry the light to his bedside table before extinguishing the main lamp for the night. He turned, the candle held steady in his large, scarred hand, its gentle light softening the rugged lines of his face and illuminating the quiet warmth in his eyes. He started to walk toward the part of the cabin where his cot lay. As he passed her, Ellie reached out, her movement a fluid, unthinking impulse. She did not grab his arm or block his path. She simply laid her hand gently on his, the one holding the candle. Her touch was feather-light, but it stopped him as surely as if she had thrown a bolt on a door. He paused, looking down at her hand on his, then up at her face. The small, flickering candlelight danced in her eyes, reflecting a universe of emotion, gratitude, devotion, and a deep, quiet desire. The journey from the terror of the stagecoach to this single, peaceful moment was etched in the lines of her face, illuminated by the flame he held. She leaned in, her voice a bare whisper, so soft it was almost a thought, meant for him alone in the vast, silent night. "Don't blow it out." The words hung in the warm, still air between them. Simple, yet holding the weight of everything they had endured and everything they had become. It was not a request about a candle. It was a plea for the light in his eyes to never dim. It was an invitation to let this feeling, this moment of perfect, earned peace, burn through the night and into all the nights to come. It was the final, whispered word in their long, silent conversation of love. Silas stood perfectly still. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath. He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw in his gaze a complete and profound understanding. He saw her not as the frightened girl he had rescued, but as the woman who had stood beside him, who had fought for him, who had healed him with her unwavering care. He saw his partner, his equal, his heart. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. His expression, usually so stoic, softened into a look of such deep and tender love that it took her breath away. He did not speak. He did not need to. He turned, not toward his own cot, but toward the small table in the center of the room. He carefully placed the candle in its holder on the table. Then he reached out, took her hand in his, and simply stood with her, watching the small, defiant flame. It burned steadily, its golden light pushing back the shadows, filling the single room of the small cabin with a warm, unwavering glow. It was a tiny beacon in the vastness of the wilderness, a promise made and accepted in the quiet language of the heart. No one needed to say more. Everything important had been said in the silent offer of a coat, in a desperate leap from a moving coach, in a shared cup of water in a dry arroyo. It had been sealed in the roar of a revolver and the long, quiet hours of a sick-room vigil. It was understood in a pressed flower, a piece of sheepskin, and the joining of their hands in the night. and in the heart of the great, Wild West, in a hidden valley that had become a sanctuary, the small candle burned on, a silent testament to a love that had not been found, but forged in fire and shadow, a light that would not be extinguished. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with you, so please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.